everyone. Kia ora, koutou katoa. Please do keep your cameras on if you feel comfortable. I will now open today's session with a karakia. I te hui whā te mātauranga kia marama, kia whā taki ngā mahu katoa, te maia te kaha, araha atu, araha mai, tātou ia, tātou katoa. Welcome. Ko Charlotte Kusha, toko ingoa. It's a pleasure to see lots of familiar names and also new ones join today's webinar, which the Sustainable Business Council is thrilled to bring to you in partnership with our member organisation, WSP. Transition planning in the context of climate change involves repositioning and transforming a business model and strategy in response to climate-related risks and opportunities. It's about exploring options, charting a pathway, and taking tangible actions. To assist navigating the mahi involved in transition planning, the External Reporting Board has released several guidance documents to support climate reporting entities. These include a guide for directors, executives, and importantly, a guide specifically for staff, the practitioners leading this work on behalf of their organisation. You may be aware there are in fact two XRB staff guidance documents, which we will pop links to in the chat function for you to access. First guidance document, titled XRB Climate-Related Disclosures Staff Guidance Transition Planning Disclosures, is focused on the actual disclosures of the transition planning. The second guidance document, titled XRB and SBC Transition Planning Guidance for Staff, relates to the transition planning process, i.e. the underlying work required to take your organisation through transition planning. This guidance was released by XRB and SBC and is the document which we'll be focusing today's session on. I do want to take just a moment to mention our sincere thanks to the amazing team at Oricon for their time and dedication as a key author of the document. Today we'll be running a panel discussion with Matt Raeburn, Asia Pacific Climate Disclosures Lead at WSP, facilitating a conversation with Jenika Phipps, Manager, Climate-Related Disclosures at the FMA, Jeremie, Madamour, Principal Advisor, Climate Change and Sustainability Reporting at XRB, and Kate Wilson Butler, Director, Climate Sustainability and ESG at Chapman Tripp. Thank you in advance to all the speakers for taking the time to join us today. I'm sure I speak for everyone on the call to say we're really looking forward to hearing your insights. Lastly, from me, we would love you to participate in the conversation by asking your own questions. Matt will pick these up after the panel discussion. Please either pop your question in the Q&A function. If you don't see that function in your bottom bar, you just go to the more and the three dots and click on that and you'll see it there. Or you can ask your question verbally, just raise your virtual hand once we move to Q&A. Thanks very much and enjoy. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Charlotte. Tēnā koutou, KWSP, ahoe mahiana. Asia Pacific Climate Scenarios Lead, Tokutuko Mangahi, ko Matt Raeburn aho. How are you doing? I'm Matt Raeburn, WSP's Asia Pacific Climate Disclosures Lead down in Te Whanganui, Atara in Aotearoa, aka Wellington, New Zealand. And thanks to Charlotte and the SBC for asking me to MC. And I also wanted to acknowledge Wani Chua from Oricon, my regular coffee buddy. She and her Oricon team supported the SBC and XRB with this recent tranche of guidance, with Jeremie and Amelia Sharman from the XRB, of course, doing most of the heavy lifting and organization. And Kate and I reviewed the pre-release draft guidance and provided feedback. And Jenika has been in her role at the FMA since the month that XRB's Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards went into effect. So we have a diverse audience from New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere, and this session is for everyone, including if you're more interested in the strategic value of transition planning than in the disclosure requirements themselves. But we'll keep the context very short about what transition planning is and why we do it so that we can get into the Q&A. Our focus today will be on of many guidance documents, I think, at this point, that are available. As Charlotte said, one is how you disclose your transition plan publicly to investors, creditors, insurers, other users. The other is how you actually perform and implement transition planning. Just indulge me for a moment. I promise that there's a point to this, but I'd like to share this quote from All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. In the end, we all come to be cured of our sentiments. Those whom life does not cure, death will. The world is quite ruthless in selecting between the dream and reality, even where we will not, between the wish and the thing. The world lies waiting. So texted me last night that our grandmother, Marie Gerotheo Graham, passed away at age 97. She was a wonderful Greek-American woman, and her grandchildren called her Yaya, and she died comfortably in hospice with several of her 6 children and 8 grandchildren around her after a long and prosperous life. We should all be so fortunate. And I'm reminded of when I asked my Kiwi and English friends how they felt about Queen Elizabeth passing, and one of them summed it up just saying, she's always been there. And it's the same with my Yaya. She's always been there. It's been a foundational assumption in my life. And in contrast, when I lost my parents, those were shocks. I thought I'd be more prepared for my dad, even though my mother had passed suddenly years before him. I wasn't. And those shocks and those changes to my foundational assumptions, they affect how I live my life and how I see the future, and more importantly, how I can act, knowing that so much is beyond my control, but doing what I can to better prepare for how the future could unfold. That, in essence, to me, is transition planning. Transition planning is those aspects of an overall strategy that describe targets, including any interim targets and actions for the transition towards a low emissions, climate resilient future. Definitions from the Australian and international standards are similar to the XRBs. That transition planning builds on prior work and brings it into consistent long-term repositioning and transformation. It's an iterative and dynamic process. We say transition planning because we're not developing a certain and finished plan. And this diagram of overlapping circles is from the guidance that we'll be covering today, showing how transition planning brings together underlying work streams, which my WSP colleagues and I have tweaked with a bit to emphasize the importance of the implementing transition work program. And that's where you actually act on your transition planning. Just briefly about that first piece of guidance related to disclosures. This was issued by the XRB in December. It supplements prior disclosure guidance for all sectors, but says more about transition planning disclosure specifically. The key elements from it include explaining direction, actions, funding, and targets, and how those should be disclosed in the transition planning context. There's a suggestion for a clear and cohesive narrative to link your transition planning's elements together. This is part of that storytelling process that begins with the climate scenarios and scenario analysis. And you start transition planning and disclose useful and material information, even with imperfect information. That's inherent to any strategic process, so don't wait for that perfect information. It's not going to come. And entities aren't expected to disclose all the details of your strategy. Try putting yourself in your investor's shoes, but obviously you need to keep commercially in confidence parts of your strategy confidential. And the other piece of guidance that we'll talk about, that implementation piece, I just want to read an excerpt from it. A transition plan truly embedded in an organization's day-to-day operations results in KPIs, monitoring and accountability lines, and other processes aligned with the long-term strategic intent. The execution should be supported by appropriate adjustments in structure, processes, capability, and leadership to elicit an organizational culture aligned with the strategy. And some can call that a transition work program. So transition planning is not just about how you show by your disclosures, how you intend to manage climate-related risks and pursue opportunities by taking tangible actions. It's also how you actually manage those risks and opportunities with tangible, could be no regrets or other tangible actions or preparatory actions. And that's reflected in that guidance that Jeremie worked on, which was published in March. So again, just to try to limit our questions to the transition planning aspect today, it is that culmination of that disclosure process, but we're really just trying to focus on transition planning itself, which also looks a bit like this. I think we'll refer to this diagram as we start to take some questions. But in the meantime, that's all from me, and we will open it up. We've already gotten a number of questions already, so I think I'm going to start with Jenika. who mentioned at the beginning of this as we were preparing that this is the first time that the FMA has spoken publicly about transition planning. So very fortunate to have you here. But just as a general matter, how's the FMA thinking about transition planning?
Thanks, Matt, and kia ora, everyone. It's really nice to be here. So, as the regulator of the regime, I've got four kind of key messages today around how we're thinking about this. The first one is that actually it's not mandatory as part of this disclosure regime to have a transition plan. What is mandatory is that you need to disclose how you will position yourself as the economy transitions towards low emissions, climate resilient future state as in the standards, which could be we will position ourselves no differently than we currently do. We don't have any mitigation or adaptation targets or actions, and therefore we don't have any transition plan aspects of our strategy. So the second key point is that it's up to each organisation for how they want to respond to their climate-related risks and opportunities and to their assessment of strategic resilience, so those other disclosures that are flowing into transition planning. This is a disclosure regime, and although there are some disclosures that do mandate data collection and analysis, so there's a scenario analysis, risk and opportunity assessments, the operational and strategic decisions for what climate reporting entities do with that information is up to them. The regime does not mandate actions in terms of strategic actions. Also, you don't necessarily have to have targets, which then again leads on to actions. Last 2 points. As the regulator, we focus on the wording in the climate standards. And although we use XRB guidance to help us understand or interpret disclosures, we're really focusing from an enforcement and feedback point of view to entities on the specific wording in the standard. We can't enforce what's in the XRB guidance. So in terms of transition planning, what's really important is that definition, which is an aspect of an entity's overall strategy that describes an entity's targets, including interim targets and actions for its transition towards that low emissions, climate resilient future. So these are adaptation and mitigation targets and actions is, in the most simple sense, what transition planning is boiling down to. To wrap up those points, although it doesn't mandate action, it is the point, right? If you have risks and opportunities, the point of the regime is for organisations to have that foresight to do something about it. But again, it's up to you. And final point from me is just, some of this guidance is around the how-to of transition planning, which is not necessarily where I would be, as the regulator, best placed to answer the how-to questions. I'm really more focused on the disclosure. So luckily we have a great panel here today that will be able to answer those how-to questions, but just setting the scene in terms of some of the different roles that we have. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jenika. One of the questions from participants, they're interested in any reflections on the likelihood of New Zealand's climate disclosure regime being brought into closer alignment with Australia's. Jeremie, I might go to you first, and then Kate to get your experience, maybe working with some trans-Tasman organizations. But Jeremie, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, a couple of things. So first, I want to signal that we have released the request for information. The consultation is ongoing until the end of June, I think. And it is about this international alignment, because international alignment is and has always been important for us at the XRB. That's part of our role, to ensure that international capital can go into New Zealand as easily as possible. But then beyond that, there is a question of what do we mean by international alignment, because there are divergence out there, and it doesn't exist yet. So then the question to entities is what matters the most for you, and more importantly, why? So we can understand what the right balance to strike there, because obviously some entity will have more interest in their export markets in Europe or the US or China, and other will prefer to align with Australia because they have a bigger company there. this kind of thing. So please have a look at the RFI and tell us what you think about it. We also want international alignment that will make everyone's life easier, but what it is exactly is more tricky. About specifically Australia, we are looking at what's happening out there. We are talking with our counterparts in Australia, and they are going to go into their first year of implementation. They are already going to face some challenge, so we are going to look closely what they are learning from it and what we can learn from it too. Another point I wanted to make in relation with international alignment, and more specifically about transition planning, is that the UKTPT has issued some guidance. We have participated to some of this work before it was released. Now it has been handed over to ISSB, but the ISSB mandate is just about the disclosure, not really about developing the best practice of how to do it and what's the best way of doing it, what's the most useful for primary users. So this work is continuing internationally. So now it's working through the International Transition Planning Network, and we are part of it, and we are working with other counterparts from all around the world as this, I guess, area is evolving and maturing.
Great, thanks, Jeremie.
And
Kate,
finally,
anything to?
I forgot something.
Okay.
Very important
Please.
one. We are the XRB, we are the standard setter. We are not making the choice for the government. The government is making their own decision about the settings of the regime. So ultimately, we are following the mandate that has been given to the XRB. We are not making up the rules.
Great, thanks. Fair enough. Hopefully everybody's roles and responsibilities are sufficiently clear, and neither the FMA nor XRB are responsible for any legislative changes. I'm sure Amelia would want that to be clear if she were here. Kate, can you speak more to that international alignment piece based on your experience?
Sure thing, Matt, and kia ora koutou, ko Kate Wilson-Butler toku ingoa. Lovely to be here and see so many familiar names and faces on the call. So certainly we're working with a range of entities who might be dual listed across Australia and New Zealand, or otherwise have an international presence, which makes the idea of international alignment desirable, right? That you wouldn't be reinventing the wheel unnecessarily, and that you would be able to use as much as possible disclosure material and repurpose that across jurisdictions. And what I would also give a plug that Jeremie didn't mention in his usual humble approach is the interoperability tool that the XRB has published alongside the RFI, because I agree with Jeremie that it's the key question is, yes, the concept of international alignment is very attractive, but what do we mean by that in practice, and with which jurisdictions are we aligning? And that is the answer to that will be different for every entity, depending on which jurisdictions they're operating in, where their customers are, the primary users to whom they're speaking with these disclosures. And so looking in particular at that interoperability tool, which closely places their NZCS requirements alongside the Australian standard requirements, gives you a good sense of what that might look like in terms of the difference between New Zealand and Australia as it stands currently. So I don't really have an answer, but I do encourage those entities who might be thinking that international alignment sounds good to look more closely at what they mean by that, which jurisdictions they're operating in or they're selling to, and what a step change in the New Zealand disclosure requirements to align more closely, for example, with Australia, or potentially with other jurisdictions that have an ISSB modelled disclosure regime might look like in practice, and then might require in practice too, in terms of the disclosures that would necessitate.
Thanks, Kate. I'll co-sign onto all of that too. Question for you again, Jenika. You said that targets are not required as part of transition planning, but we're hearing from our assurance partner that they would expect targets for climate risk and opportunities, not just emissions. Thoughts?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, look, the first thing I'd say is that there has been a lot of confusion around this in the market. in terms of what is mandatory for transition planning. And I guess this feeds into it in terms of targets as part of transition planning. The FMA perspective is that that's not mandatory. I'm not sure exactly what your assurance engagement is covering. There may be some specifics there. This kind of feeds into another question we've been getting a lot in terms of maturity or level of detail in a transition plan, which could encompass, do we have to have adaptation targets and mitigation targets? How do we answer the disclosure requirements around those two aspects, which I think may be where this question is coming from, if I'm interpreting it correctly, around do we have can we disclose around transition planning with only mitigation targets, so your greenhouse gas emissions targets, or do they have to be bigger in terms of responding to risks and opportunities? And I think there's also a best practice. Best practice, yes, if you have material risks and opportunities, yes, that would make sense in a business decision-making perspective to respond to those with some targets and actions to mitigate those risks and opportunities. But from a disclosure perspective, you can just disclose what you are or are not doing. So you could say we do have, mitigation targets, which fits into that transition plan definition of describing your targets. You could say we are considering having adaptation targets. Best practice would be to have both if you have, material risks and opportunities in both of those spaces. But again, it's just saying what you do and don't do. And that XRB guidance around disclosure actually has some really relevant examples that talk to this as well. So I'd really encourage you to revisit that. Thanks for the question.
Great, thanks. And happy to take follow-up if people have follow-up questions. But just, somewhat related to what you've been saying, Kate, if entities don't have a transition plan, why would they want one? And are there legal reasons or things that they should be considering as they're developing a transition plan?
Thanks, Matt. And just recognizing and acknowledging the question that's just come through, or the observation rather, that's come through the Q&A that says the value of the disclosures or value of transition planning lies in the process and internal strategic decision making and sort of integrating transition across your business, recognizing that and acknowledging it. The reality is a little like Jenika, people often come to Chapman Tripp as legal advisors when they're thinking about what they need to do to comply and also how they mitigate legal risk. So we're probably looking at more at the disclosures end of the spectrum rather than the strategic transformation end of the spectrum oftentimes. But I mean, Jenika said, if you don't have a transition plan, you don't have to disclose one. And I think when thinking about the legal considerations or rationale for why you might want to pursue this work, three things come to mind. There's the compliance perspective, quote unquote, and I'll come back to that. Other sort of legal risks that a transition plan might help to mitigate, which I'll broadly term as greenwashing. And then I think speaking to broader primary user expectations, which is not necessarily strictly legal, but I think is relevant. And if I can just briefly cover off each of those, I think I would argue when we think about sort of compliance, and I keep doing the inverted commas because I think that compliance, when we're talking about a principles-based regime such as the New Zealand regime, is not black and white, and particularly so with transition planning, which is so entity specific. But I would argue that many organisations already have the key elements of transition planning present within their business and sometimes already within their disclosures. So, for example, in year one, many entities, when they reported their climate-related risks and opportunities, they also described how they were responding to those and the strategic actions that they were taking. And so that's the bones of your transition plan, right? And I would guess that most entities would have something relevant to disclose here. I've yet to encounter a company that doesn't do anything to respond to the climate-related risks and opportunities it's identified. So even if they don't necessarily describe it in those terms, it's worth reflecting on whether there is something that forms the bones of your transition plan that is to be disclosed as against CS1. And then I think if that is the case, it becomes about, well, how do you create that coherent narrative that you referred to before, Matt, looking at, as the disclosures guidance talks about, the direction, action, funding and targets that you're working with. keeping in mind the specific wording in paragraph 16 of the standard, which talks about how the business model and strategy might change to respond to the risks and opportunities you've identified. So creating that link between the risks and opportunities and the strategy. And then the requirement to describe the extent to which your capital deployment and funding decision making is aligned with your transition planning, which again is a more of a process-based disclosure, but is really asking you how you're financing your transition initiatives, and to describe how that's is that part of your core kind of BAU funding decision making, or is that something different? So I think that it's worth reflecting, even though you might not technically have to have a transition plan. I think most entities would have something that is relevant to the transition plan disclosure requirements. And then just briefly on the broader mitigating legal risk piece, just if I can kind of butcher that Cormac McCarthy quote, Matt, I would argue that maybe between the wish and the thing, legal risk lies waiting. And the transition plan also, I mean, it's a place where you can talk about your strategy, and you can talk about how the business is transforming to the extent that it is. But it also is a place where you talk about that ambition, maybe it's your targets, the action that you're taking to support that ambition, and also critically the delta between the two, and explaining how you're thinking about what you're going to do to bridge that gap and anything that you don't know, right? So the uncertainties that are inherent with this work, and particularly with those long-term targets. And so I think the cold hard legal reality, just to underscore this, is that all statements in the CRD need to be substantiated and not misleading. That's what the legislation says. And particularly if we're thinking about forward-looking statements, which includes your targets, they do need to be subject to reasonable basis and a genuine belief at the time you're putting them out to the market. So your transition plan provides that key platform, that place to provide credibility to those claims and commitments, and to articulate all those things that might stand in the way of you achieving them. So your dependencies, your assumptions, your risks to execution, and that really helps avoid those statements becoming misleading and providing that reasonable basis. So I think there is a quote that is in one of the XRB, maybe it's the director guidance, which I love, which comes from the Integrity Matters report that was done by the UN High-Level Experts Group a few years ago, which is something along the lines of, while no entity can predict the path to 2050, and a transition plan that's frequently updated can make your pledges and your ambitions concrete whilst highlighting those uncertainties, assumptions, and barriers. And I think that nicely encapsulates the role the transition plan can play in helping you both articulate your strategy, but also mitigate some of that legal risk as well. I might leave it there. Thanks, Matt.
We can't hear you, Matt.
No.
Yes.
How about now? Good. Just mute and unmute. Yeah, I just want to echo quickly that it's really important to realize that this is an exercise like for your own benefit, to get a more transparent understanding of where you're at. Otherwise, you can't do anything about it. And as I tell my clients too, like, you can just be transparent about, we've done our scenario analysis, and we've looked at how we're going to be really in trouble with this current business model under these orderly 1.5 degree aligned transition risk heavy scenarios. And we've looked how our business model is going to fail under the physical, more physical impact oriented hothouse scenarios, and we're just going to go with it. And and that's just what we're going to do. And investors, you can now make decisions based on that. Like, you can do that. I don't think that that's a great idea, and I've yet to see any takers from organizations that want to be that frank. But this is, the brilliance of these standards and this guidance is that it makes it very, very hard, I think, relative to other, similar ESG exercises that I've seen in my years as an environmental lawyer and consultant now, that it makes it very hard to do that kind of greenwashing. So people will try, but all they're asking is just like transparency with investors, creditors, lenders, other primary users. And that's hard. That kind of honesty is hard, and there are risks to that. But the risks in not being transparent, I think, are far greater. Although Kate can speak to maybe the legal risks of that. In fact, Kate, do you want to speak to the legal implications of that?
Sure. I mean, it comes back to what I was saying really about the Financial Markets Conduct Act, which regulates this is the boring legal bit. Now I'll get through it quickly. Financial Markets Conduct Act, which regulates the climate disclosures regime in New Zealand, has the so-called fair dealing provisions, which require statements that you're putting into your financial communications to be substantiated and not misleading. And so, yes, absolutely. If you're not doing anything to transition your business, you can say that. Equally, if you're not doing anything to transition your business, you can't say that you're doing something to transition your business. And I think therein lies the magic of this regime, which is that oftentimes, as you say, Matt, an entity will come to think about what it's going to disclose and think, oh, that doesn't actually sound how we want it to sound. That's not the message that we necessarily want to put out to our investors and other primary users about how we're running this business. And that's what triggers the transformation work, I think. But ultimately, I think that there's a question in the chat about navigating board hesitancy to make forward-looking statements in external documents like the CRD when transition planning and other sort of qualitative forward-looking statements you might make in your CRD as well are inherently forward-looking and inherently uncertain. And I think that's where it comes back to truth and transparency every time, but at the same time acknowledging that there is much that we don't know about this transition, about how an individual entity or sector will transition, but also what's going to happen across the economy, domestically and globally, right? And I think articulating that and being frank about that and acknowledging that no entity has all the answers yet is a really critical part of mitigating some of that risk about being potentially misleading by overreaching with what you're saying about what you're going to achieve or what you're planning to achieve. You're on mute, Matt.
Richard Hour, anything else you can say more about kind of your experience, like some of the ways you try to message this with directors? Because, usually there's, sometimes they let the consultants stay in the room for these board meetings, but they certainly let the lawyers in. What are some of the messaging techniques that you've found to be more successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's something that we've talked about a little bit is responsible ambition or responsible transition, which is take the steps that you want to take to progress your transition planning, to pivot your strategy, and then speak responsibly about that in the ways that I've just described. And I think it will come down to the entity and the board's appetite to undertake that strategic work. So there are entities who are purely looking at the disclosures end of this and are wanting to do what needs to be done to comply with the regime, and that is fine, right? That is an acceptable approach, as Jenika said. It's within the contemplation of the regime that you simply disclose what you're doing, and anything else is left out. I think for those entities who are wanting who are really thinking about the strategic value of this work and what image they want to present to investors, to customers, to other stakeholders who might be consuming and using these disclosures, that's where the conversation with whether it's management or the board becomes about, well, how can we frame what we're doing in a way that puts that message out, but also we make sure that we've got the work behind the scenes that is backing that up, so that it is a substantiated disclosure that we're putting out into the market.
Yeah, on that, I would like to come back to the initial question about target. Just to be very clear, you shouldn't make up target just for the sake of your disclosure. It's supposed to be target that you are using. And also this question, I guess, is a good reminder of why this regime was put in place in the first place. It has been made mandatory because the goal was to level the playing field, and people were not making it a priority, but it's coming from a push from financial institutions that want that. So there is an expectation from your insurance provider. It's not about what is requested in the disclosure. Like Jenika said, it's a disclosure regime. So don't make up target you are not actually using. That's not the intent at all.
Can I also jump in? Thanks, Jeremie.
Please.
Just around the director's question, just from an FMA perspective, we do like to continue reiterating our educative and constructive approach, which feel free to pass on to your board members. I'm sure they're aware already. From a regulation perspective, we are quite cognizant that this is so new and it has moved really fast and it's really hard. And I can understand the nervousness of directors. But in terms of how we're regulating the regime, we are really taking that constructive, educative approach. And the second part I would mention is that I think in terms of practical advice, if you can really help directors to understand what the disclosure requirements are in terms of their technical understanding, because I think some of this is stemming from the fact that it's new and there may be some gaps in understanding, which is creating heightened risk. But if you really understand the disclosure requirements, some of that risk should be mitigated by what it's really trying to achieve and what it is really requiring. So yeah, again, I would just reiterate that technical understanding, trying to help directors to understand those requirements so that they feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I think that's great advice and would apply to anybody who is part of the disclosure process. We're just really looking for a transparent self-assessment at first, and you don't have to disclose everything that's done internally. The transition plans that we develop and detailed work streams and roles and responsibilities, the really exciting stuff that we've been doing with clients this year, and Kate, I'm sure you have too. It doesn't all have to go into a 300-page disclosure document, and some of that stuff is commercially sensitive, but it's the strategic value, and it's been great to see so many. Like when I was at the Climate Governance Initiative event that IOD held last year, I think you were at that too, Kate, if I'm remembering right. But it was just so great to see all of these. Fortunately, it wasn't just a consultants get together, and it wasn't necessarily more directors who were on the younger side. It was a lot of experienced directors really interested in this. So I suspect, just based on my own experience, that there's more of a risk appetite in these directors when they understand what they're getting into than there may be from people at other levels of the organization. So yeah, for you directors out there, definitely encourage you to ask questions and really embrace the process, because it is valuable, and not just for your climate resilience, but probably from resilience from all sorts of things. Tariff stuff, all kinds of foundational assumptions being knocked out from under us as of late. And also a belated thanks to my former colleague Sally Bamber for that key point before about the value of transition planning. We have another question from an anonymous person. Again, you can ask these questions anonymously. I know not everybody wants to put their potentially revealing questions out there with their name attached to it. So how and why are non-climate related entities doing transition planning, understanding that smaller companies may not have the resources to do it credibly, which opens them up to legal risks, which disincentivizes making any public statements? Kind of a green hushing question. Kate, do you want to maybe take that first?
Sure thing. And it's a great question. And I think it comes back to the strategic value of this work. I think, a range of entities, whether or not they're mandated to disclose the transition planning aspects of their strategy, see that, maybe they've done scenario analysis, they've got a range of climate-related risks and opportunities, and they're wanting to understand then how they can pivot to best manage those risks or realize those opportunities. And I think it's often those entities who really see it as core to strategy who are doing this work voluntarily. And then in terms of what's ultimately being disclosed, and a lot of work is being done behind the scenes that may not ultimately be disclosed if that's not mandatory. So that's point one. And then I think point two is comes back to that point that I touched on really briefly at the outset, which is thinking about the broader audience for this work. So yes, you know, if you're a mandatory CRE, you might be putting out your transition plan because it's part of, you know, the New Zealand climate standards. But also there are potentially other users of your transition plan, right? Including customers, I don't know, ratings agencies, if you're in that world. So it's worthwhile thinking about that broader audience in terms of what it is you ultimately put out to market, whether or not you're a CRE, I think, because there are potentially a range of benefits to articulating how it is you're transforming the business to respond to some of this, but equally doing so responsibly, just to come back to the legal risk. Sorry, Jeremie, you've got your hand up. I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, just wanted to nuance a bit the idea that because you're small, you can't do it credibly. Because, as Jenika said, it's about disclosing where you're at, what you are doing or what you plan on doing. And even if you are not doing much, but you're doing something, you can do that. You can also be transparent about, we start by focusing on a very specific area because that's the only thing we can manage and we think that's our top priority. That's already a good information for a primary user, because in the end, primary user, when they are looking at it, you can I guess look at the publication of some of them. They are going to be assessing the maturity of the risk management of an entity, for example. And so even if you are feeling you don't have a lot of resource, just signaling that you are thinking about it, and if you are intending to do something, talking about it, that's probably a good information. That's probably a good idea to disclose it, to inform them so they can make the best decision. And I guess I will link also to our consultation last year when we proposed to have a delay and to extend the adoption provision of a range of disclosure, including transition planning. Then the pushback from some of the primary users was, we don't expect a fully fledged transition planning year one, but it's better to have some information than no information. We just want to be able to assess where the entity is at, how they intend to progress, where they are going, these kind of things. So even if you are small with low resource, as long as you have, I guess, a room to have this conversation internally, then you are probably able to do a good job at making a disclosure.
Thanks, Jeremie. A question from Jess Roger at IAG. Any recommendations for trans-Tasman entities where transition planning is framed differently in the Australia Sustainability Standards Board's requirements? Yeah, great question, Jess, and this is coming up a lot for these trans-Tasman entities. Kate, do you want to maybe speak to that first?
Yes, with the caveat that I'm not an Australian qualified lawyer and not intimate with the Australian standards requirements for transition planning yet. I mean, I think it would come back just to, you know, thinking about what you're doing within the business, and then having that transition plan internally, but then perhaps articulating different aspects of that based on what the standard says in Australia versus New Zealand. I think the other point that I would come back to is also who the reporting entity is in each jurisdiction, because there may be some slight nuance. So for example, if you're part of a group that might be trans-Tasman or multinational, there'll be aspects of your transition plan that is group-wide, and maybe that's the bulk of your transition plan, but there may also be aspects that relate to the local entity that is the reporting entity. And so that's worth thinking about in terms of the nuance of what you might disclose jurisdiction to jurisdiction as well. But I'll open that up, and maybe that Jenika or Jeremie have thoughts on that.
I do. So first I will redirect to our great interoperability table that makes the comparison requirement by requirements, either coming from Australia to New Zealand or from New Zealand to Australian standards. So you can have a look at all the detail in there, and the overview in a Word document. One thing I would like to say from our perspective is this is why we have been trying to support the implementation on the underlying work that is below the disclosure to help entities to figure out what kind of process they need to put in place to generate the information that then they will be able to put in any framework of a disclosure. So hopefully, if you've done the work to be able to disclose under New Zealand climate and ZCS standard, then you will be in a good position to disclose under the requirements of the Australian one.
Just one thing from me on this one. In terms of mutual recognition of other jurisdictions, this is something we are currently discussing with ASIC in Australia. And as soon as we have any kind of update or direction, we can communicate to the market. So potentially that will be more streamlined in the future, but this is definitely not any guarantee in terms of what I'm saying right now, but they are conversations that they're having at the moment.
By the way, people are curious. ASIC released some guidance a few weeks ago about their approach to this, and I would never speak with the FMA for the FMA while they're here, but my sense for ASIC is that they're to the extent that they swing their stick at all in this first year, it's going to be swung quite lightly. This is very new to organizations, and they're taking a educative approach as well. So I understand that people, especially in New Zealand, directors are very concerned about that whole personal liability bit, which I don't want to get into today. But yes, this in my sense is that the only risks are really come from not doing the obvious things that are required or in obfuscating what you're actually trying to do. It just will not benefit you to be anything less than transparent, even if that doesn't suit the narrative that you would prefer to have. Another question from my former Ministry from the Environment colleague, Ben Nister, that came in before, is about speaking to the guidance for MIS managers in relation to transition planning. Jeremie, would you like to help us pivot to that bit?
Sorry. So yes, I mean, there are examples for MIS manager, banks, and insurer in the guidance. So please have a look. What the guidance is doing is pointing toward a series of existing tools and to illustrate how they can be used in the specific context of systemic risk like climate. And so an entity in the finance sector will still be able to follow the process, even if it probably will have different area of focus. They might use some slightly different language and words, and even come up with how to apply their usual methodology, as long as it fits with the specific characteristic of climate-related risk and opportunity. Because in the essence, even if you're in the finance sector, you're a MIS manager, you still have a value proposition. Hopefully you have a strategy, and you need to test these through the climate scenario. And then with this scenario analysis, you can question if the condition of this value proposition are still going to be compelling moving forward in the future, and what it might mean for your investment decision. So for example, instead of focusing on specific physical risk to specific assets, you might focus on asset category at a more systemic perspective. You can also focus more on your processes, on your decision making, how it is going to be taking into account climate related risk and opportunities moving forward.
Well said, Jeremie. Thanks for that. A few more questions. We'll try to get through all of them before we run out of time. For organizations that business strategy is inherently a transition strategy, such as transport, I would say that renewable energy, I mean, just about any sector can be part of that, but transport certainly. Is there a need to develop something new that is labeled as a transition plan, or can we allude to our existing organization strategy and what we're already doing? Kate, you already, I think, answered this somewhat, but if you'd want to rephrase a bit and reiterate.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. This is a great question because it's one that we get a lot, and we we're talking about this just on the call earlier, that actually for many entities, particularly those who are in hard to abate sectors or have particularly stark exposure to climate risk, whether it's transition or physical, that they've already recognized and have already developed strategy to respond to. We don't see a need to reinvent the wheel, right? That you might already have the key elements of what might be termed a transition plan baked into your strategy. So it's really about how you're articulating that, and are you articulating that in a way that responds to the standards and makes sense to your primary users as well.
Great, thanks, Kate. Question from kind of a comment and a question from James Hughes from TNT. Of course, you had to weigh in, James. I think the risk of using uncertainty, for example, around technology as a reason to water down or caveat targets in transition planning is clearly understandable, but isn't there a tension about this being an easy out and doesn't reflect the urgency of action? How do you see this tension playing out? I mean, just, to take that myself first, the uncertainty is going to be a reason always for inaction for entities that do not want to act. And as there was a reason that I use that analogy about kind of different kinds of deaths in my own family, about the different kinds of uncertainty that we deal with and how things can change very, very abruptly, or things that you come to depend on can change. And it's really about, I think, finding those organizations that are willing to do it. One thing I really enjoy about this, especially as somebody who cares very deeply about climate change, is that I don't have to convince anybody within these organizations about what they should do to deal with their climate risks and opportunities. That's not really my job. And I think, some organizations will get more comfortable once they realize that I'm not there to try to force them to, decarbonize before it's financially viable to, or to put in resilience actions that are not cost effective for them. It's about understanding what you can do to meet the moment when it comes, because so much is out of their control. And so the urgency is in being prepared and having a strategy so that you can respond when that happens. And at this point, the organizations that don't do that, that will work itself out. Unfortunately, for the investors and employees, and for those of us who want to see this done as efficiently and quickly as possible, given the global urgency, there are going to be some consequences to that. But that's, after 20 years of being a lawyer and consultants and in and out of government, that's kind of where I've landed, is people are going to have to make these decisions for themselves about whether or not they can live with the uncertainty, this kind of uncertainty, in addition to all the other kinds of uncertainty that they, of course, have to deal with. But anybody else want to add to that, Jeremie?
Yes, please. So maybe a slightly different take on the question. I don't think uncertainty is a good reason at all, and I think the standard and the guidance are pretty clear that uncertainty is not a good reason to not disclose anything. So just to be very clear, by definition, a strategy is always about forward-looking. It's always uncertain. You never know if it will work or not. And transition planning is an aspect of a strategy. So there will be uncertainty. And the question is, how do you address this uncertainty? And so to the specific point about technology, then you can say you don't know which technology you are going to pick. You can say you don't know how fast the technology will become available or affordable, whatever. But at least you should make it clear that if you have nothing else and you are choosing to do nothing because you're waiting to see the development of a technology, then that in itself is a strategy. And it should be clear to primary user that you are making a conscious choice to wait, and it's dependent on something else out of your control, maybe. And it should be very clear what is in the realm of action of the entity and what is in the realm of dependency of the entity and other things happening.
Great. Thanks, Jeremie. Kate.
To jump in and I'll keep it brief, but I can't help myself. Thank you, James, for the probing question, as always. I don't know if I would see uncertainty as a reason to water down targets or ambition, and rather I would see sort of articulation of, exactly as Jeremie has said, assumptions, limitations, uncertainties as a way to hold on to that North Star, even as the world around us changes, right? And I'm just reflecting on the current, geopolitical, broader economic situation, being able to say, look, we don't have all the answers. Here's where we want to go. Here's what we're aiming at. And we know a little bit about how we're going to get here. Maybe we know the path to 2030, but beyond that, there are things that we don't know and which remain outside of our control. In my experience, creates greater appetite to hold on to that ambition, notwithstanding some of the challenges that could potentially lie in the way. And it also speaks to, I guess, the broader kind of legal regime and potential liability regime that we talked about, Matt, and I know we're not going into on this session, but helps, I think, both management and directors feel more comfortable. Just to cite an example, in Australia, the energy company Santos was taken to court by the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility because they claimed, part of the claim was that they had a clear and credible path to 2040, which relied on certain technology, hydrogen blending and carbon capture and storage, which wasn't necessarily proven to be viable either economically or at the scale implied by the transition plan that they had put out to market. Whereas if they had articulated that with respect to, what's known, what's not known, where the uncertainties might lie, this is speculation on my part, of course, but perhaps that might have been viewed differently in the way they presented that to investors. So I think there is value in recognising that we don't have all the answers, and just to plug CS3, which requires disclosure of assumptions, methodologies and limitations as well. So there is anticipation of that in the standards.
Great, thanks. That just reminds me, I do want to emphasize that strategic...
Well, you're just quite quiet, Matt.
Sorry?
You might
the
need
strategic intent. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. The strategic intent piece of the guidance, that is not something to kind of go through the motions on. We do that as a distinct process and exercise because it is so important to understanding what you want your organization to be in the future, so that you know what that North Star is. So really spend some time on that. Last question before we run out of time for Jenika. On the level of detail, if FMA can comment on expectations in terms of what needs to be disclosed around transition planning, noting the observations earlier around potential commercial sensitivity, materiality thresholds. I mean, you've spoken to this somewhat, but anything further to add?
Yeah, look, again, it is a materiality question, which you have put in your question as well. Level of detail, it needs to be enough that it's clear what your targets are and what your actions are, and any and how you're going to position yourself. So in answering those disclosures, it just needs to be clear. We have seen some climate statements that really have too much detail. So there is a balance here. We've seen some that don't have enough, some that have too much. It's really, I think, being succinct is something that we're aiming for here, but understandable and transparent. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't give a super clear answer because it depends. But yeah, don't necessarily err on the side of heaps and heaps of detail, because it has its own problems with obscuring what's actually material. Really just wanting to get the main point across. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks. And I think we'll have to leave it there. I will, and Charlotte, I might impose on you to be somebody who can send these answers to the questions that we didn't get to, but I'm happy to help answer some of the outstanding questions, as I'm sure my fellow panelists are. But in the meantime, here's ways to reach out to us directly, but we will try to address those remaining questions. And thanks so much for your time and attention, and thanks to my panelists. This was really great. I wish we could have gone for 3 more hours on this, but we can't. So Charlotte, I'll hand it back to you.
Amazing. And yeah, echo everything you've just said. Now, we will try and answer any remaining questions. Just feel free to either email them through to Matt or myself. Matt's details are on the screen that you can see now. I feel like we could have had longer, so much conversation, really insightful session. So yeah, thank you to Kate, Jeremie, Jenika, and Matt. Really appreciate your time. I will close now with the karakia. Ka mutu
Please.
Yes.
Just about the question, please send question even after the webinar, because we are thinking about what we could do in the space of FAQ, or the most asked question or myth busting or whatever that we could share on our respective websites, the FMA and ourselves. So please think about the question for you. Apologies, Charlotte, for interrupting you.
No problem. Please get in touch with the speakers and the panelists with your questions or any queries so they can capture all of those. I will close now with the karakia. Ka mutu a mātou mahi, mō tēnei wā, manakatia, mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, allocate te orangi. Ka kite anō, everyone. Have a fabulous day, and we will see you soon. Thank you.